What happens when a 10-year-old girl's innocent summer dream meets the cold, hard wall of adult prejudice. On a sun-drenched street. Little Astra Washington set up a simple card table, hoping to sell lemonade to help build a garden for her community. But she wasn't met with smiles. She was met with scorn, viciously mocked by her wealthy neighbors for her ambition, her background, and the color of her skin. Her spirit began to crumble. They thought their cruelty was a private neighborhood affair. They were wrong. Because a powerful stranger was watching, and he was about to serve a glass of justice so cold it would change their lives forever. The sun on Tuesday, July 15th, was relentless. A great golden eye in the cerulean sky, baking the manicured lawns of the Maple Creek subdivision until they smelled of sweet cut grass and money. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, the kind that drove most residents into the refrigerated hum of their oversized homes. But not Astra Washington. For 10-year-old Astra, the heat was a partner, an essential ingredient in her grand business plan. She navigated the slight incline of her driveway with the intense focus of a CEO heading into a board meeting. Her small frame was a study in concentration. Her brow furrowed, her movements precise. In her arms, she carried the first piece of her enterprise, a slightly wobbly card table. Its faux wood-grain top faded from years of family barbecues and garage sales. She positioned it perfectly at the end of her driveway, right where the pristine concrete met the public sidewalk, a strategic location she'd scouted for days. It was a nexus point visible to the dog walkers, the joggers, and the slow cruising cars of Maple Creek. Her mother Dana watched from the porch, a tired but proud smile playing on her lips. "You sure you don't need any help, sweet pea?" she called out, wiping her hands on her nurse's scrubs. She'd just come off a 12-hour shift at the county hospital, and the fatigue was etched around her eyes. Astra looked back, her face breaking into a brilliant grin that momentarily erased her businesslike focus. "I got it, Mum. It has to be my own. That's the whole point." The whole point was a sketch taped to their refrigerator, drawn in Astra's determined crayon strokes. It depicted a vibrant vegetable garden with neat rows of tomatoes, towering sunflowers, and fat orange pumpkins. In the corner, a sign read, "The Maple Creek Community Garden. Everybody welcome." The vacant weed-choked lot at the edge of their subdivision was a blight in Astra's eyes, a sad, forgotten space. She saw not what it was, but what it could be. A place where Mrs. Henderson, from down the street, who was on a fixed income, could get fresh vegetables, and where the kids who spent their summers bored could learn to grow something. The project required seed money, $200 to be exact for lumber, to build the raised beds bags of quality soil and starter plants. It was a fortune to a 10-year-old. So she'd devised a plan complete with cost analysis and projected earnings, all scribbled in a spiral notebook. The centerpiece of this plan was Astra's Sunshine Lemonade. She made a second trip this time, carrying a large, clear glass dispenser with a little spigot filled with a pale yellow liquid. Real lemons, squeezed by her own hands, floated inside, mingling with slices of orange, for a secret citrus twist. She'd used her grandmother's recipe, one that called for a hint of vanilla, a touch that made it taste like liquid sunshine. Finally came the cups, a perfect pyramid of waxy paper, and the cash box, a decorated shoebox with a slit cut in the top. Her sign, painted in bubbly, cheerful letters on a piece of cardboard, was the last touch. Astra's Sunshine Lemonade, fresh and delicious. $1 a cup. Help us build a community garden. She sat down on her little plastic stool, smoothed out her brightly colored sundress, and waited for her first customer. The world from her vantage point was perfect. The scent of her mother's rose bushes filled the air. A bee buzzed lazily past the lemonade dispenser, and the oppressive heat meant people had to be thirsty. It was simple, beautiful logic. Her first half hour was quiet. A few neighbors waved as they drove past their car windows, sealed the air conditioning blasting. Astra gave each one a hopeful, enthusiastic wave. She wasn't discouraged. Business she knew from the books she read at the library was about patience. Then she saw her. Beatrice Bea Worthington was Maple Creek royalty, or at least she carried herself as such. She was a tall, angular woman with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it had been sculpted rather than grown. She was walking her two miniature poodles, Snowball and Crystal, who were less like dogs and more like animated cotton balls in tiny rhinestone-studded sweaters, a ridiculous sight in the sweltering heat. Bee's eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, scanned the street with an air of constant low-grade disapproval. Her gaze swept over perfect lawn after perfect lawn until it landed on Astra's humble setup. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows arched, and her pace slowed. She stopped directly across the street, her lips pursed into a thin, bloodless line. She didn't cross. She just stood there, staring. Astra felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't a curious look. It was an inspecting one, the kind of look you give a piece of trash that has blown onto your prize-winning petunias. Astra, ever the optimist, decided this was her chance. She stood up and gave her most professional-looking wave. "Good morning, Mrs. Worthington. Would you like a fresh cup of delicious lemonade?" Bee's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. She tugged on the leashes of her dogs, pulling them away from a particularly interesting patch of grass. She said nothing, but her message was clear. She looked at Astra's stand, then at the Washingtons' modest, well-kept but decidedly smaller house, and then back at the stand. A tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she turned and continued her walk, her back ramrod straight. The rejection was a small, cold stone in Astra's stomach. It was more than just a no thank you. It felt personal. She sat back down, her cheerful posture deflating just a little. 10 minutes later, another figure emerged. It was Gary Thompson, a retiree who lived 3 houses down. Gary's passion in life, since leaving his mid-level management job at the Department of Motor Vehicles, was the Maple Creek Homeowners Association's Book of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. He carried it with him sometimes, a thick vinyl-bound Bible of bylaws. Today, however, he just had a clipboard. "Well, well, well," Gary said, his voice a reedy instrument of passive aggression. He stopped at the edge of Astra's driveway, rocking back on his heels. "What have we here? It's my lemonade stand, Mr. Thompson," Astra said, her voice bright, trying to reclaim her earlier enthusiasm. "I'm raising money for a community garden." She pointed to her sign. Gary's eyes scanned the sign, but he didn't seem to be reading it. He was looking for violations. "A commercial enterprise, I see," he mused, tapping a pen against his clipboard. "On residential property. And a sign. Is that sign more than 2 square feet in area? The bylaws are very clear about signage." Astra blinked. It's just a drawing, sir. A drawing that advertises a product for sale." Gary countered, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a minor infraction. "And this structure," he gestured to the card table. Is it secured? We can't have unsecured structures becoming a hazard in the event of high winds. Section 14, subsection C. The cold stone in Astra's stomach grew heavier. The sun didn't feel like a partner anymore. It felt like an interrogator's lamp. I don't know, sir. It's just a table. Just then another car pulled up to the curb. It was Karen Miller B. Worthington's closest friend and confidant. Karen was softer around the edges than B, both in physique and personality. But she was a follower, quick to adopt the opinions of whomever she perceived as the leader. She got out of her pristine white SUV, leaving the engine running. "B just called me," Karen said, her voice pitched with manufactured concern as she walked over to join Gary. "She said someone had set up a flea market stall." She looked at Astra's stand, and a look of pity so exaggerated it was insulting crossed her face. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, her voice dripping with condescension. "Is this what you have to do for pocket money? It's so quaint." The word quaint was delivered like a dagger wrapped in silk. "It's not for pocket money," Astra said, her voice small but firm. Her chin was trembling slightly, but she refused to let them see her cry. "It's for a garden. For everyone." Bear had apparently completed her circuit and was now approaching from the other direction, her poodles yapping at her heels. She'd clearly planned this a pincer movement of suburban scorn. "For everyone," Bee scoffed, finally breaking her silence as she joined the group, forming a semicircle of judgment around the little girl and her card table. "Honey, the people in this neighborhood don't need a community garden. We have Whole Foods delivery. What we do need is to maintain our property values. And this," she waved a dismissive hand at the stand, "this is an eyesore. It lowers the tone of the entire street. It looks cheap." The word hung in the hot, still air. Cheap. Astra flinched, as if she'd been struck. She looked at her carefully made sign, her grandmother's beautiful glass dispenser, her neat pyramid of cups. She'd poured all her heart, all her 10-year-old ambition into this little stand. And they were calling it trash. "It's not cheap," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I made the lemonade myself." "Oh, you made it yourself," Gary piped in, seizing on a new line of attack. "Do you have a food handler's permit?" "A business license. The health code is very strict about the sale of homemade consumables. We don't know what's in that. The liability for the HOA could be astronomical." "It's just lemons and sugar and water," Astra pleaded, looking from one stony face to another. She felt like she was shrinking. The whole world, once so full of promise, had narrowed to this tiny patch of concrete and these 3 pairs of cold, unforgiving eyes. "That's what they all say," Bee said with a sigh of deep theatrical weariness. "Look, dear, this isn't the kind of neighborhood for this sort of thing. Why don't you just pack up your little project and take it inside before it becomes a real problem?" The unspoken threat was as heavy and suffocating as the humid air. "We will make it a problem." Tears now streamed freely down Astra's cheeks. Her dream wasn't just dying. It was being murdered right here on the sidewalk by clipped vowels and phantom regulations. The vibrant colors of her crayon-drawn garden plan seemed to fade to gray in her mind. She wrapped her arms around herself, a tiny heart-broken figure against a backdrop of perfect houses and perfect lawns. They stood there for a moment longer, a triumvirate of petty tyrants seeming to savor their victory. They had successfully crushed the spirit of a child. They had protected the tone of Maple Creek. They were so absorbed in their conquest that none of them noticed the slow, measured footsteps approaching from behind them. They didn't see the tall, broad-shouldered man in a simple but exquisitely tailored grey suit, his dark skin glistening slightly in the heat. They didn't see the quiet authority in his posture, the profound intelligence in his deep-set eyes, or the way his gaze took in the entire miserable scene in a single sweeping glance. He had heard everything, and his face was a mask of calm, controlled fury. The man's shadow fell over the group before his presence was fully registered. It was a long, sharp shadow that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat, bringing with it a sudden, inexplicable chill. Karen and Gary, who had been huddled in their self-satisfied bubble, turned in unison, their expressions of smug superiority faltering. Standing before them was a man who commanded space simply by occupying it. He was at least 6'3", with a presence that was simultaneously imposing and serene. His hair was cut short, salted with distinguished grey at the temples. He wore no tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone, yet his suit, a lightweight summer wool, fit him with the kind of perfection that costs more than a mortgage payment on some of the smaller houses in the neighborhood. But it was his eyes that held them. They were dark, discerning, and possessed a stillness that was deeply unsettling. They were the eyes of a man who was accustomed to listening to weighing words and to seeing straight through to the truth of a matter. He didn't look at the adults first. His gaze went directly to Astra. He saw the tear tracks on her cheeks. Her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture of self-protection, the way her small shoulders shook with silent sobs. His expression, which had been one of cold anger, softened infinitesimally as he looked at her. He took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the pavement, and crouched down, bringing himself to her level. The movement was fluid and graceful, devoid of any awkwardness. The adults behind him seemed to fade into the background, their presence suddenly diminished, irrelevant. "Hello there," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that was both gentle and powerful. "My name is Arthur. What's yours?" Astra looked up, startled. She swiped at her tears with the back of her hand. Astra," she stammered. "Astra," Arthur repeated, tasting the name. "That's a beautiful name. It means faith in Swahili, doesn't it?" Astra nodded, her eyes wide with surprise that this stranger knew the meaning of her name. A tiny flicker of her spirit, which she thought had been extinguished, sparked back to life. "Well, Astra," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a warm smile. "I have been walking for a very long time, and I am incredibly thirsty. I was hoping I might be able to buy a cup of what looks like some of the best lemonade I've ever seen." He gestured to her dispenser, where the lemons and orange slices floated like captured sunlight. His words were a soothing balm on the raw wounds of the insults she'd just endured. "The best lemonade I've ever seen." Before Astra could answer, B. Worthington found her voice, though it was now laced with a sycophantic sweetness that hadn't been there moments before. "Oh, hello," she trilled, stepping forward. "You must be new to the neighborhood. I'm Beatrice Worthington. We were just explaining to the little girl that this isn't really appropriate." Arthur rose slowly to his full height, turning to face her. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial calm. He looked from B to Karen to Gary, his gaze lingering on each of them for a beat too long, making them squirm. "Explaining, son?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. It sounded to me less like an explanation and more like a coordinated campaign of harassment against a child. Gary Thompson puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his lost authority. Now see here, sir. I am on the board of the Homeowners Association. We have rules, regulations. There are issues of permits, commercial activity, health codes. Arthur held up a hand. The gesture was simple, not dramatic, but it had the immediate effect of cutting Gary off mid-sentence. Permits. Arthur mused, his eyes locking onto Gary's. Are you an official agent of the city's Code Enforcement Division, sir? Well, no, but I. Are you deputized by the County Health Department? Of course not, but the HOA has a responsibility. So you hold no official authority whatsoever. Arthur stated not as a question, but as a final, incontrovertible fact. You are merely a private citizen, citing rules you have no power to enforce, using them to intimidate a 10-year-old girl. Is that an accurate summary? Gary's face turned a blotchy red. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering like a car that wouldn't start. Arthur then turned his attention to Karen, whose face had gone pale. And you, madam, you mentioned a flea market stall. An interesting choice of words. Do you often find it necessary to belittle the honest efforts of children? I was just concerned, Karen stammered, wringing her hands. B said, Ah yes, B. Arthur said, his gaze finally settling on the self-appointed queen of Maple Creek. You were concerned about property values and the tone of the neighborhood. You called this child's heartfelt project an eyesore. You told her it looked cheap. He took a deliberate step closer to her. B, for the first time in what was probably decades, took an involuntary step back. Her poodles, sensing their owner's fear, whimpered and hid behind her legs. Ma'am, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. I have seen real eyesores. I have seen poverty and desperation that would curdle your blood. I have seen true ugliness in this world, and it rarely has to do with aesthetics. It has to do with the corrosion of the human spirit. The kind of casual cruelty you and your friends have displayed here today. That is the ugliest thing I have seen in a very long time. That is what lowers the tone of a neighborhood. The three of them stood in stunned, horrified silence. They were being dismantled piece by this man's words. He was using their own logic against them, turning their petty concerns into weapons that exposed their profound moral failings. He turned his back on them, a gesture of complete dismissal, and crouched down again in front of Astra. She was looking at him with a mixture of awe and adoration, her tears forgotten. He was her knight in shining armor, though his armor was a bespoke suit. Now, he said, his voice returning to its gentle warmth. About that lemonade. I'll have 1 cup, please. Astra fumbled with the cups, her hands shaking slightly. She placed one under the spigot and carefully filled it to the brim. She handed it to him, her small hand brushing against his large one. Arthur took a long, slow sip. He closed his eyes, savoring it. My goodness, he said, opening his eyes and looking right at her. That is without a doubt the finest lemonade to have ever been created. Your grandmother's recipe is a treasure. A real genuine smile, the first in what felt like an eternity, blossomed on Astra's face. Thank you, she whispered. That will be $1, she added, remembering her role as a businesswoman. Arthur reached into the pocket of his suit trousers and pulled out a money clip. It was a simple, elegant silver clip holding a thick fold of $100 bills. The sight of it made Bea Karen and Gary's eyes widen in unison. This was not just a well-dressed man. This was a man of serious means. He peeled off a crisp bill and handed it to Astra. "Here you go," he said. Astra stared at the bill. It was a $100 bill. "Sir, I don't have change for this," she said. Her voice filled with panic. "Oh, don't you worry about that," Arthur said with a chuckle. He took another sip of his lemonade. "In fact, this raises a new issue. A product this good. It shouldn't be sold by the cup. It's too inefficient." He stood up and looked at the lemonade stand. He tapped the glass dispenser thoughtfully. "Tell me, Astra," he said, "how much for the whole operation?" Astra blinked. The whole operation. Everything," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "The table, the sign, the cash box, the cups, and every last drop of this magnificent lemonade. I'm buying the entire stand. Name your price." The question hung in the air. Behind him, B. Karen and Gary looked on their faces a comical mask of shock and disbelief. This stranger wasn't just defending the girl. He was making a statement so bold, so extravagant, it defied all comprehension. Astra's 10-year-old mind raced. The table was old. The sign was cardboard. The value was in the lemonade. How much was it all worth? She thought about her goal, the number that was the entire reason for this enterprise. She took a deep breath, looked him straight in the eye, and said the biggest number she could think of. $200, she said, her voice clear and steady, for the community garden. Arthur's face broke into a magnificent, radiant smile. $200, he repeated. He turned his head slightly, just enough, to ensure the three antagonists could hear him perfectly. Sold. The word sold echoed in the silent, superheated air of the cul-de-sac. It was so final, so absolute, it seemed to create its own gravitational pull, drawing all focus to the man in the grey suit and the little girl with the lemonade stand. B. Karen and Gary were frozen, their brains, struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. This wasn't how the world worked, not in Maple Creek. In their world, problems like this were supposed to quietly disappear under the weight of social pressure and veiled threats. They weren't supposed to escalate into a public spectacle of high-finance lemonade acquisition. Arthur reached back into his pocket, retrieved his money clip, and with a practiced flick of his thumb, peeled off 2 more $100 bills. He folded them neatly around the first one he'd given Astra. "A contract is a contract," he said, his voice light but firm. He held the money out to her. 100 for the product and the assets, and an additional 200 because I believe in your project. Consider it your first official grant for the Maple Creek Community Garden." Astra stared at the $300 in his hand, her eyes as wide as saucers. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. It was garden beds and soil and seeds, and maybe even a fancy new watering can. It was her dream, not just realized, but magnified, handed to her in a neat fold of green paper. She reached out a trembling hand and took the money. It felt warm and crisp and impossibly real. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, thank you." "The pleasure is all mine, Astra," Arthur said. He then turned to the 3 stunned onlookers. His demeanor shifted again, becoming brisk and businesslike. "Now, since I am the legal owner of this enterprise," he announced, gesturing to the card table, "I'll need some help managing my new acquisition. You, sir." He pointed a long, commanding finger at Gary Thompson. Gary flinched. "Me?" "Yes, you. You seem to have a deep and abiding interest in the structural integrity of this table. I'd like you to perform a full inspection and then transport it to my car, which is parked just around the corner on Oak Lane. Be careful with it. It's an antique now." He then swiveled his finger toward Karen Miller. "Madam, you will be in charge of inventory. I want you to carefully stack these cups, ensuring none of them are crushed. They are valuable assets." Finally, his gaze fell upon Bea Worthington. A wicked, almost imperceptible glint appeared in his eyes. "And you, Mrs. Worthington, you have a keen eye for aesthetics. Your job will be to take down that sign, but I want it handled with the utmost care. It's a piece of original folk art, and I intend to have it framed." He paused, letting his instructions sink in. He was not asking. He was commanding. The authority that radiated from him was so immense, so unquestionable, that the idea of refusing seemed impossible. He had, in a single brilliant move, transformed them from neighborhood bullies into his personal moving crew. They were being forced to respectfully dismantle the very thing they had just viciously mocked. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. For a moment, rebellion flickered in Bea's eyes. Her mouth opened ready to unleash a torrent of indignation. "Who do you think you are?" But Arthur preempted her. "My name," he said, as if reading her mind. His voice dropping back to that calm, lethal tone, "is Arthur Sterling, and I would advise you all to do exactly as I say." The name landed like a bomb. Gary Thompson's face, which had been a blotchy red, turned a pasty, sickly white. His clipboard clattered to the ground. Karen Miller let out a small, terrified squeak. But it was Bea whose reaction was the most profound. Her jaw, which had been set in a mask of defiance, went slack. All the color drained from her face, and she looked as though she might faint. The name might not have meant anything to the average person on the street, but to the residents of Maple Creek, a community filled with lawyers, executives, and people whose livelihoods depended on navigating the complex corridors of power in the nearby city. The name was legendary. Judge Arthur Sterling. Not just any judge. A federal judge, Tortier. Appointed for life. He presided over the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, a man whose decisions affected corporations worth billions of dollars, whose rulings shaped federal policy, whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in the city's most powerful boardrooms and law firms. He was one of the most powerful men in the entire state. And he lived apparently just around the corner. Bea's husband, a high-flying real estate developer, had a massive zoning variance case pending in federal court. It wasn't in front of Sterling's bench, but the federal judiciary was a small, interconnected world. The mere perception of being on the wrong side of a man like Arthur Sterling could be catastrophic. Gary Thompson, in his obsession with minor rules, had just tried to lecture a federal judge on regulations. Karen Miller, the social butterfly, had just insulted a man who could blacklist her and her husband from every important event in the city with a single quiet word. The karma wasn't just coming for them. It had arrived, and it was wearing a handmade suit and a deceptively gentle smile. Without another word, a silent, frantic panic descended upon the trio. Gary, his hands shaking, practically dove for the card table, treating its wobbly legs with the reverence one might afford a holy relic. Karen began stacking the paper cups with the trembling precision of a bomb disposal expert. And Bea Worthington, the queen of Maple Creek, the woman who had servers to serve her servers, walked stiffly over to the cardboard sign. Her manicured hands, which had probably never touched anything more common than an Amex black card, reached out and gently, carefully lifted the eyesore from its perch. She held it as if it were the Magna Carta, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Judge Sterling watched them for a moment, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. He had passed his sentence, and it was being carried out immediately. He then turned back to Astra, who was clutching her $300 to her chest, looking on with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Astra," he said softly, breaking the spell. "It was a profound pleasure doing business with you. I have a feeling your community garden is going to be a great success." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. On it was his name, his title, and a single phone number. Arthur Sterling, United States District Court Judge. "If you or your mother ever need anything," he said, pressing the card into her hand, "and I mean anything at all, you call this number. It goes directly to my clerk. They will always know how to find me." He gave her a final warm smile and a slight wink. "Keep the faith, Astra," he said. And with that, Judge Arthur Sterling turned and began to walk away, his long, confident strides eating up the pavement. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that behind him, 3 of the most entitled people in Maple Creek were scurrying to do his bidding. Their world irrevocably shattered by a 10-year-old girl and her grandmother's lemonade recipe. Astra stood there, holding a small fortune in one hand and a direct line to one of the most powerful men in the state in the other. She looked at the 3 adults, now her unwilling employees, moving with a terrified urgency. She looked at her empty patch of driveway. The sun was still beating down, but it felt different now. It no longer felt like an interrogator's lamp. It felt like a spotlight. Just then, her mother Dana, who had been watching the entire drama unfold from the doorway, with a growing sense of disbelief and awe, finally came running out. "Astra, honey, are you okay? Who was that man?" she asked, her voice a jumble of concern and shock. Astra looked up at her mother, and for the first time a full understanding of what had just happened began to dawn on her face. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her lips. "That was my first investor, Mom," she said, holding up the money and the business card. "And I think we just had a very successful grand opening." Across the street, partially hidden behind a sheer curtain, another neighbor, a tech-savvy teenager named Leo, lowered his smartphone. He had recorded everything. The mocking, the confrontation, the judge's arrival, the stunning revelation of his identity, and the humiliating aftermath. He looked at the footage, a slow grin spreading across his face. The Maple Creek Community Facebook group was about to get the most explosive post in its history. The verdict had been delivered on the sidewalk, but the true consequences were just beginning. Leo Ramirez was not by nature a pot stirrer. He was a quiet 17-year-old, more comfortable in the digital world of code and online forums than in the meticulously curated social landscape of Maple Creek. But he had a strong sense of justice, a trait inherited from his public defender father, and he had a particular dislike for Beatrice Worthington, who had once tried to get the HOA to fine his family for having a basketball hoop that was, in her opinion, aesthetically jarring. He had started recording when he saw B. Karen and Gary first approach Astra's stand. He'd sensed the familiar energy of a public shaming about to commence. What he captured was pure, uncut social dynamite. He spent 10 minutes editing the video. He was skilled cutting quickly between the key moments: Karen's flea market stall comment, Gary's pedantic lecture on bylaws, and the pièce de résistance, B's "it looks cheap" line, delivered with maximum disdain. He then cut to the arrival of Judge Sterling, his calm takedown of each of them, the stunning moment he revealed his name, and the final glorious shot of the 3 of them acting as his personal moving crew, their faces etched with horror. He chose not to add any commentary. The footage spoke for itself. He titled the post simply, "An Interesting Afternoon on Hemlock Lane." Then he uploaded it to the private Maple Creek Community Forum on Facebook, a group with over 2,000 members, and sat back to watch the world burn. It didn't take long. The first comment appeared in under a minute. It was from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman Astra had hoped to help with the garden. "That's little Astra Washington. She's the sweetest girl. What on earth are they doing to her?" The second was from a lawyer who lived on the next block. "Wait, is that Judge Arthur Sterling? I've argued before him. That's him. Oh my God." And with that, the dam broke. The post exploded. Likes, shares, and comments flooded in at a dizzying pace. The reaction was a tidal wave of outrage. People who had long suffered the petty tyrannies of B and the HOA board in silence suddenly found a collective voice. I'm not surprised at all. Bayer tried to have my son's treehouse torn down last year. Gary Thompson tried to measure the height of my grass with a ruler once. A ruler. To do that to a child. And for what selling lemonade for a community garden, I'm disgusted. I'll be donating to that garden. Someone post a link. The digital wildfire leaped from the private Facebook group to the wider internet. Someone downloaded the video and posted it to Twitter, tagging several local news outlets. By dinner time, #lemonade. Judge was trending in the city. The story was just too perfect. A sweet entrepreneurial black child, a trio of Karen antagonists, and a powerful real-life hero. It was a modern-day fable, and it was irresistible. For the three antagonists, the evening was a descent into a private hell. Gary Thompson, after delivering the table to the judge's pristine detached garage, under the watchful eye of Sterling's unimpressed housekeeper, scurried home, his heart hammering in his chest. He locked his door and immediately went to his office, pulling out his thick binder of HOA rules. He frantically searched for a loophole, a justification for his actions, something he could use to defend himself. But the black and white text offered no comfort. All he saw were the words of Judge Sterling echoing in his mind. "You hold no official authority whatsoever." His wife found him an hour later, staring blankly at a page detailing regulations for satellite dish placement. "Gary, what's wrong?" "The phone won't stop ringing. People are saying the most awful things on the community page." She held out her iPad, the screen glowing with the video. Gary looked at his own face, twisted in a mask of self-importance, and felt a wave of nausea. Karen Miller's ordeal was more intimate. She returned home to find her 2 teenage children waiting for her in the kitchen. Her son, a lanky 15-year-old, held his phone up. He didn't have to say a word. "Mom," her 17-year-old daughter asked, her voice quiet and laced with a deep, painful disappointment that was far worse than any shouting match. "Was that really you? Is that who you are?" Karen burst into tears. "You don't understand. B said, we were just—" She couldn't finish the sentence. How could she explain that she had mortgaged her own conscience to stay in the good graces of a woman like B. Worthington? How could she look her children in the eye when they had just watched her bully another child on the internet? Her karma was the look of shame in her own children's eyes. But for Beatrice Worthington, the night was a cataclysm. After carefully placing Astra's sign in the trunk of her Mercedes, as if it were a Ming vase, she drove home in a state of cold, stark terror. She didn't just understand the social implications. She understood the financial ones. Her husband, Robert Worthington, was a man whose entire empire was built on leverage connections and reputation. Their entire lifestyle, the house, the cars, the country club membership, was predicated on his ability to get deals done. She found him in his study, a grand room of dark wood and leather, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. He was staring at his computer screen, his face ashen. "Robert," she began, her voice trembling. "There was an incident. An incident," he roared, spinning around in his chair. His face was purple with rage. "An incident, B. I just got off the phone with Marty Grossman, my lead counsel, who told me that a video of my wife harassing a 10-year-old girl in front of a sitting federal judge is the #1 story on every news blog in the city." He slammed his glass down, the scotch sloshing over the rim. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea at all? Judge Arthur Sterling. Of all the people in the entire godforsaken world, you had to pick a fight in front of him. I didn't know who he was," she cried, a pathetic defense that sounded feeble even to her own ears. "You weren't supposed to need to know who he was," Robert bellowed, advancing on her. "You just weren't supposed to be a monster to a little girl selling lemonade. How hard is that? The Holston Project, B. The multi-million-dollar zoning variance we've been working on for 2 years. The deciding vote on the council is Frank Miller, Karen's husband, who is now getting crucified online because of you. The chief planning officer's wife runs a charity that Sterling's wife sits on the board of. It's a house of cards, and you just took a flamethrower to the foundation. The fight was brutal, stripping away the polished veneer of their power couple marriage to reveal the ugly transactional machinery beneath. The words divorce, ruin, and humiliation were thrown around like weapons. Bear retreated to their cavernous bedroom, the sound of her husband smashing his scotch glass against the wall, echoing behind her. She collapsed onto her silk duvet, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had spent her entire adult life meticulously building a fortress of social standing, a castle of perceived perfection. In a single afternoon, it had all been brought crashing down, not by a rival socialite or a stock market crash, but by a little girl, a cardboard sign, and a glass of sweet lemonade. Meanwhile, in the small, warm home of the Washingtons, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. Dana had ordered pizza, and she and Astra sat at their kitchen table, the $300 laid out neatly beside the pizza box. Astra's phone, an older model Dana had passed down to her, was buzzing incessantly with messages from friends who had seen the video. Dana had created a simple GoFundMe page for the Maple Creek Community Garden, linking it in the comments of Leo's video. Donations were pouring in. $10, $25, $50. In just a few hours, they had surpassed $5,000. People were including messages of support from one gardener to another. Make something beautiful. Astra. This is for every time a bully tried to dim a child's light. Shine on. I'll bring my shovel and help you build it. Let us know the date. Astra watched the number climb, her eyes shining. It was more than she had ever dreamed. It wasn't just money for lumber and soil anymore. It was proof. It was proof that for every B. Gary and Karen in the world, there were hundreds of people willing to stand up for what was right. She picked up Judge Sterling's business card from the table. She traced his name with her finger. He hadn't just bought her lemonade. He had given her something far more valuable. He had shown her that one person standing firm in their convictions could hold back the tide of ugliness. He had restored her faith. The sun had long set on Hemlock Lane. For Astra Washington, it was the dawn of a new, brighter reality. For her tormentors, it was the beginning of a long, stone-cold night of reckoning, one they had brought entirely upon themselves. The consequences were just getting started, and they were about to become painfully, irrevocably real. The days following the lemonade incident were a master class in the mechanics of karma. The consequences for B. Gary and Karen didn't arrive in a single blow, but as a slow, unraveling cascade, each misfortune leading inexorably to the next. For Gary Thompson, reckoning arrived on Thursday morning in a white van bearing the city's official seal. A polite inspector named Mr. Davies explained they'd received an anonymous tip about unpermitted structures. Gary's blood ran cold. He knew this was a message from Judge Sterling's world. For years, Gary had terrorized neighbors over minor infractions, while his own property harbored major violations: a large, unpermitted deck and a fully wired workshop with illegal plumbing. The inspector was thorough, his pen making neat, damning notes. The verdict was devastating. Gary was cited for numerous code violations and given 90 days to either spend over $50,000 to legalize the structures or tear them all down. The inspector's parting words were the cruelest. "You know Mr. Nartatrat Thompson," he said, shaking his head. "The rules are there for a reason. An HOA board member like you should understand that." The self-appointed guardian of the bylaws was being undone by his own hypocrisy. Karen Miller's consequences were more intimate. Her husband Frank, a city councilman with mayoral aspirations, came home one night looking defeated. "The Halston deal is dead, Karen," he said, slumping into a chair. Robert Worthington had become politically radioactive after the video. No one on the council would touch a project associated with him. Frank's ambitions and their social standing were collateral damage from her desperate need to please B. Invitations to fundraisers stopped. Neighbors offered cold stares at the grocery store. Her breaking point came a week later, watching from her car as Astra and a team of laughing volunteers worked in the now thriving community garden. She had tried to help crush this beautiful thing, and it had flourished in spite of her. In that moment, she realized her friendship with B wasn't a bond, but a prison of her own making. The most spectacular downfall, however, was reserved for Beatrice Worthington. The video was a corporate and social catastrophe. Her husband Robert, whose real estate empire was built on reputation, was facing ruin. She found him in his study, his face purple with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he roared, slamming down his Scotch glass. "I just got off the phone with my lead counsel. A video of my wife harassing a child in front of Judge Arthur Sterling is everywhere. The Halston project. Our investors. Our reputation. It's all a house of cards. And you just took a flamethrower to the foundation." The fight was brutal, stripping away the polished veneer of their marriage. That night, Robert told her he was filing for divorce. Her reign was over. But Karma's final act was a masterstroke of poetic retribution. 2 weeks later, Astra received a formal invitation to the Urban Gardeners Alliance annual gala. She was being honored with a special award for her inspirational work in community building. The invitation noted that a special benefactor had arranged for the award and purchased a table for her family, Judge Arthur Sterling. B was also there. Her divorce lawyer had insisted she attend to begin the long process of rehabilitating her image. It was torture. She was a ghost at the feast, invisible to the people who once fawned over her. She watched as the city's elite mayors, philanthropists, CEOs lined up to congratulate Astra. She was forced to witness the world she had clawed her way to the top of, now revolving around the very child she tried to destroy. The final blow came during the award presentation. The presenter was Judge Sterling's wife, who spoke eloquently about hope and community. Then she revealed one last detail. This entire event, and the substantial grant that comes with this award, Mrs. Sterling announced, has been underwritten by a generous one-time donation. We'd like to thank Worthington Properties for their contribution. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. Bea felt the blood drain from her face. It was the masterstroke. As part of the divorce settlement, Robert, desperate to salvage his company's reputation, had been persuaded by his lawyers to make a massive tax-deductible donation to a charity of Judge Sterling's choosing. Beatrice Worthington was funding the celebration of her own downfall. She was paying for the spotlights, the catering, and the Crystal Award praising the girl she'd scorned. She stood on trembling legs and fled the ballroom, the sound of thunderous applause for Astra Washington chasing her down the hall like the closing of a tomb. Autumn painted Maple Creek in hues of gold and crimson, and on the once-forgotten lot, Astra's Sunshine Garden was a thriving testament to her vision. The space had become the neighborhood's new heart, where raised beds overflowed with kale and tomatoes. It was a place of quiet redemption, even for Karen Miller, who showed up every Saturday to pull weeds. She never asked for forgiveness. But one day, Astra's mother offered her a bottle of water with a small accepting nod. It was a start. The garden's success was a stark contrast to the fates of the others. Bea Worthington had divorced and moved away, vanishing from the social world she once ruled. Gary Thompson was mired in a costly battle with the city over his unpermitted deck, undone by the very rules he once weaponized. Their story was a fading, cautionary tale. The real story was here in the rich, dark soil. One bright October afternoon, Judge Arthur Sterling appeared at the garden gate. Astra's face lit up, and she ran to give him a fierce hug. "You came," she exclaimed. "I had to see the return on my investment," he said, his eyes twinkling as he surveyed the vibrant community space. He walked with her along the path, his expression one of deep satisfaction. He saw neighbors laughing, sharing produce, and working together. He stopped and looked directly at Astra, his voice full of sincere warmth. "In my line of work, you see a lot of the worst of humanity. It can make a man cynical," he admitted. "But then something like this happens. One good person with faith refuses to be bowed by ugliness, and you remind people like me what we're actually fighting for. You, Astra Washington, are a remedy for cynicism." Astra felt a swell of pride so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. It was the greatest compliment she had ever received. Looking up at the man who had believed in her, she straightened her shoulders, her inner businesswoman taking over. "Would you like to take some kale home?" she asked, her voice clear and bright. "It's free for our investors." Judge Arthur Sterling threw back his head and laughed, a deep, joyful sound that echoed through the peaceful garden. "I would be honored," he said. "I would be absolutely honored." Astra's story is a powerful reminder that the world can and often does bend toward justice. It shows us that you don't need a fancy title or a powerful position to stand up to cruelty. Sometimes all it takes is a 10-year-old girl with a pure heart, a pitcher of lemonade, and the courage to plant a seed of hope. The actions of Judge Sterling were a catalyst, but the real magic happened when the community chose to nurture that seed, turning an act of hate into a harvest of love. This story is for anyone who has ever felt small, overlooked, or shouted down. It's proof that your light matters. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of kindness to overcome prejudice, please help our community grow by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. What starts as a comment or a share can create a ripple effect of positivity. Let's create that ripple together. Thank you for watching.